In part 4 of this video, we're going to look at how you can submit your results for the photometry that you've undertaken. And we're going to be looking at how you submit it to the Aavso, which is the American Association of Variable Star Observers. In order to submit results to the Aavso website, you need to be both a member of the Aavso and you also need to have applied for an observer code. The Aavso website offers a vast number of resources for the Variable Star Observer, and we're going to be using some of those resources today in order to put together a measurement file that we will submit. We will ultimately submit this measurement file using the Submit and Access Data tab on the Aavso website. If we go into this particular page, you can see in the center we have Upload Photometry. And if we just look down the page, we will see the Aavso file format specifications. So we'll take a quick look at those. And we're going to be doing what's called an extended file format. And if we look down this website, we will see the format that our measurement file must be in order for it to be accepted by the Aavso. And it basically consists of two parts. A header that contains a certain amount of information here, and then the data rows themselves. And each one of the headers has a requirement for a specific input, which are described here. One of the most important of those is the observer code. And when we actually get to the data measurements, the requirements for the inputs for the data fields are specified here. And one of the longest descriptive parts looks at the various filter types that you can submit under. Since we collected these results with a CMOS color camera, and I've not done any transformation on those, so I'm going to submit this as TG or tricolor green, and these observations use a V-band comp star magnitude. And if we scroll down to the bottom of the page here, we see some example file formats. This is kind of what our file format should look like. So now we've determined what we need to submit. Now we need to go back to our measurements for V576 PEG and actually produce a measurement file in the appropriate format. We are now back to the File Explorer, and we are in the folder that I created last year where I stored my measurements for V576 PEG. If you remember, we created a science folder, which was the original untouched FITS files. We then created a quarantine folder, and we quarantined a couple of images, and we created an AIJ processing folder. And it's that folder and the data within that folder that we're going to use today. The other thing I've included in this folder today is a measurements file for an earlier run I did on a variable star, which was V474 CAM. And I'm going to use this as a template within which I'm going to put my measurements for the star we're looking at today, V576 PEG. Next, I'm going to open up AIJ and go back to the data processor. As you can see on the DP coordinate converter, we have the name of our star of interest, and all of the data for the observatory, my home location here, is also included. If I go to the CCC data processor window, what I want to do here is specify the 145 files that we are going to process. And actually, this remembers the use of the wildcard within the file name pattern from the previous relative flux run that I did. And you can see that we've identified 145 files. Now, in order to submit results to the AAVSO, we need magnitude values and not relative flux values. So we will be doing something slightly different on this run. And in order to do that, we are going to go down to the bottom of this screen and we're going to do set. This brings up the aperture photometry settings window. You can see that we're using the same aperture and annuluses that we used before. The one thing that's going to be different here is, though, we are going to have this box checked, the prompt to enter reference absolute magnitude box. This needs to be checked. And if we check that, this will allow us to create magnitudes rather than relative flux. So I've done that. I'm going to click Start. And the first thing it's going to do, it's going to take us into the multi-aperture measurements window, which basically just reflects the same data that we saw a few moments ago. But at the bottom of this page, it's going to request that I place the apertures. So here is my target star. So if I click on this, we'll label that T1. And I'm now going to click on the comparison stars. But because this is a data submission to the AAVSO, we're only actually going to use two comparison stars. One is called the main comparison star, and one's called the check star. And from looking at the previous relative flux plots, I was able to identify, before I started recording this part of the video, that two of the stars offered the smoothest relative flux curve for the target star, and it's those two stars that we're going to select for this analysis. And these stars were here. And I'm going to click on this one and it's going to label it C2. And this is the star Tycho 1718-1512-1. And when I look this up in the SIMBAD database, this has a V-band relative magnitude of 11.3. And I'm going to enter that in this window. And then I'm going to open up my second comp star that I identified. It's going to label that as C3. This is Tycho 1718-1528-1. And again, I got that from the, I went to the SIMBAD database to get the magnitude of this star in the V band, and its magnitude is 11.09. So I am now going to hit return. And we are now going to start processing photometric values for our target star. And these are going to be displayed in the measurements. We've processed all 145 images, and we have 145 rows in our measurements file corresponding to each one of those images. So let's look at this measurement file. We will see additional information in here. If we scroll across, we will now see that in addition to relative flux values, we also should find our absolute magnitude for our target star, T1, and our two comp stars, C2 and C3. And we have all the information in this measurements file now in order to create a measurements file that we can upload to the AAVSO website. Now, unfortunately, AIJ does not create a AAVSO compatible measurements file. We have to create one. But that's actually very simple. using Excel. So I am now going to close. I'm going to save this because obviously I need to be able to access this in a couple of minutes. I am going to put mag measurements as the file name, and I'm going to drop it in the appropriate folder associated with where my image files and everything are stored. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up our template for an earlier star, and I'm going to use this template to cut and paste information from the mag measurements for V576 PEG into that template so that we're ready for submission. And here's the template that I'm going to use. And the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as a star file name, AAVSO submission. Okay, and I'm going to look down through here. You can see the header here, and you can see the measurement data. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, first of all, look down through the header, see if there's anything I need to change. I've blanked out my observer code, which I will unblank out when I've actually do the submission. But as you can see, it's an extended measurement file. My observer code is here. The software was processed, or the measurements were processed with AIJ, and it was a CCD or a CMOS camera in my case thing. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to blank out the things that I need to replace. And so I'm going to go down through this file. I'm also going to change, so my filter type I'm going to submit as TG, which is tricolor green. So I'm going to copy that down through here. There was no transformation, standard filter type. Now these are the names of my comp stars and magnitudes, so these need to be changed. So the first comp star, if you remember, was TYC 1718-1512-1, and that had a magnitude of 11.35. And then my check star, that is TYC 1718-1528-1, and that had a relative magnitude of 11.09. Oops. 11.09. So I'm now going to take these four values and copy them down the spreadsheet. I need to get my air mass data from the measurement spreadsheet, so I'm just going to delete this. And this chart ID refers to a finder chart that you can get from the AAVSO. So we're going to need to create a finder chart on the AAVSO webpage and get this identifier. We'll do that in a moment. But first of all, I'm going to put in the name of my star. And I am then going to copy that all the way down the spreadsheet. And yes, there are probably more elegant ways to do this, but if you've got basic knowledge of Excel, this doesn't take very long, and it's a very simple way of getting your measurement file set up. Right, I am now going to need to take some data from our measurements file that we created a few minutes ago. And the first thing I need to do is take the date. So the date in Julian time is going to be here. So I'm going to take this date. I'm going to cut and paste this data here, copy, and I'm going to cut that back into the other. Okay, so actually now if I scroll down now, because my template is actually somewhat bigger than my than I required, I can go in and just delete these rows at the bottom that I don't need. And the next thing I need is the magnitude value of my target star. So I'm going to go back to my measurements file. I'm going to find that magnitude value. Here we go. So I'm going to take these values here. And I am going to cut and paste those values. And you'll see that obviously since they match the length of the earlier data that I submitted, it finishes at the same point. The next thing I need to specify is my measurement error. If I go back to my measurements file and look through here, I will actually see that there isn't a measurements error column. But I do have signal to noise ratio, and my signal to noise ratio is extremely high at 540. So I am going to go back here and I'm actually just going to enter a measurement error of 0.01. And I am going to copy that down the length of my submission file. And then I go across. The next thing that still requires to be put in is air mass. So I will go back to my measurements file, find the air mass column, copy that data here. And finally, I need to put in the finder chart information. And to do that, I'm going to need to go to the Aavso website. I'm going to go to the pick a star, put my name of my star, and I'm going to create a finder chart. And this is the finder chart that I initially get. If I look down at the bottom here, I see that the field of view is significantly larger than the field of view of my telescope. So I'm going to just change that. So I'm going to go into the parameters here and just do rescale the chart for 30 arc minutes across and create a photometry chart. All that information is correct, so I'm now going to do plot chart. And we're going to see here the finder chart for our star, V576 PEG. And we're going to make a note of this number here, which is X27617 PG. And here you will notice the problem sometimes with these finder charts in terms of identifying comp stars. The only two comp stars that were identified on this finder chart are 14th magnitude stars, which are 3 magnitudes down. These would not have made good comp stars. So this was why I picked comp stars from the other stars that were surrounding our target star. So now that I've made a note of that chart number, I'm going to go back to my measurements file. And copy that. Like so. So I now have my Excel format of my template complete. I need to create a comma delimited version of this file. So I'm going to do File, Save As, and I'm going to save it as a CSV file. So we have saved our measurements file for V576 PEG in an Excel CSV file format. There's one thing we need to do now before we attempt to submit this to the Aavso. We must do a little bit of editing in Notepad. So here is the file, and basically what we need to do is we need to remove all of these leading commas except for this one, and we need to resave this. Okay, so off to the Aavso website, and we now go to Submit and Access Data, Upload Photometry, Observation Files. We select our file and upload. And as you can see, it's been reported by the Aavso that these observations look correct, and they have been uploaded into the database.